Well, hi, my name is Greg and you're watching a video that's part of a series of videos that I've been producing on my 1949 P3 Rover restoration story. This video is going to be a little bit different to what I've done before. In the past, I've generally covered what I've referred to as distinct chapters where I've covered a particular part of the restoration. Today I'm going to have a go at doing something a little different. I'm going to have a go at doing what I think you'd refer to as a vlog. Although I think to strictly fit the definition of a vlog, I'd have to do two things. I'd have to release regular video updates and short video updates. I'm going to struggle with the regular part for sure, and probably with the short part as well. But anyway, in plain English, what this is, it's just a current time update on progress on my 1949 P3 Rover restoration. So let's get on and have a look at progress. Now, in an effort to make progress on this restoration and to make efficient use of my time, I made a little list so that nothing would be missed. So here's my little list. So when I was last on leave, which was sort of late last year, I made this list and worked my way through it. On the original list, there were 34 to do jobs, but as I worked my way through it, I found more and more work to do. So the list grew to about 55 jobs in the end. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just work my way through this list and show you what I've been doing. So okay, first item on my list is a fit gearbox end of speedo cable, including rubber blanking bung through the bulkhead. So I'll try and explain what I'm talking about there now. So when I bought the car, the speedo wasn't working at all. You can see the outer cable here, and that's the blanking bung that I'm talking about. So I made that up just because I had actually nothing in there at all when I bought the car. But the main problem I had was really just replacing the inner cable. The outer cable that you can see here, although you can't see too much of it, is in pretty good shape, but I had to have the inner cable remade. I've got the original outer cable here on the floor. You can see, I don't know how well you're going to see it, but you can see it's got a square drive there and a square drive at that end. Now here's a photo of the gearbox just showing where the speedo cable connects to the gearbox. So I've just circled that in blue there so you can see that bronze fitting where it bolts to the gearbox. I have to say it's a very impressive looking gearbox. No corners cut in regard to quality on these cars. So in the car now, looking at my gearbox again, I'm just going to point to where the speedo cable connects to the gearbox. You can see this sort of bronze fitting there that I'm pointing to. But initially the speedo cable connects to the back of the speedo. It tracks through the firewall or bulkhead, depending on what you want to call it. And then it tracks along a chassis member and then it ends up here. This fitting that I'm pointing to has an oil seal in it, and inside there's a direct gear drive which turns the inner cable when the car is in motion. The problem I had is that the new inner cable I had made up was just a little bit too long. This made it impossible to connect both ends, i.e. the gearbox and the speedo ends at the same time. So my first job should really read shorten the inner cable and then fit the speedo cable. I had to drive out to Strathalbyn and the Adelaide Hills, and I took it back to the guy who made the cable up for me in the first place. Now I should have taken more photos or shot more video when I was working on this speedo cable, but I didn't. I was just too busy trying to get the job done. So I've got a sketch here. It's from the Rover Sports Reddit's Rover P3 parts manual, and it shows the tail end of the gearbox here and where the speedo cable connects. So this little gear that I'm pointing to here now, that's the gear drive for the inner cable on the speedo cable. And this part that I'm pointing to here now, that's that bronze fitting that you can see in my photo. And then it's got a sort of lock bolt here. Pretty impressive bit of engineering overall. I mean, this gear looked like it was strong enough to pull a truck. The next thing I'm going to work on is item 2 on the list, remove accelerator bracket linkage and free up and packer is required to achieve free operation. And that's going to sound a bit mystifying, but I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now, an issue I wanted to resolve relates to this bracket assembly that I'm going to point to now. So you can see there's a bracket over here, and then there's a shaft that sort of bends over the steering column, and then this end of the bracket goes to this housing here. In this housing there's a little bronze bearing bush, and you can see this housing also serves as a mounting point for the fuel pump. Now there are a couple of things that I did which probably made reassembly a little harder than it needed to be, although that of course wasn't the intention. First thing I did was I had all these parts powder coated, so in the end I had to remove the paint from some areas where it goes through the bracket here, and also where it goes into the bronze bearing bush here. The other thing I did is I turned up a new bronze bearing bush that fits in this housing. The old one was pretty worn out. Now, a worn out bronze bearing bush is just an open invitation to an ex-fitter and turner, so I just had to make a new one. And of course the new one I made was a nice neat fit. But that meant that I then had to get this housing and that bracket very well aligned, otherwise things wouldn't move freely. So in the end I had to resort to making a little packer here and also a packer at this end, just to get everything sort of lined up better. It works well now, so I've got quite free movement now. So I sorted out that end, but then I found it still wasn't moving freely, and what I was finding is that the accelerator was sort of getting stuck open a little bit. So I scratched my head as to what was going on there, had numerous cups of tea, and then came to the conclusion that I had to change a couple of things. You can see this rod here, which I'll trace along, that accelerator linkage rod. And if you look closely, you can see there's an adjustment at either end. I can't see it so well down here, but trust me, there is adjustment at either end. So what I found I had to do is I had to make this rod a little longer by adjusting it out a little bit. What I needed to achieve was that when this accelerator is fully closed, that there is some tension on this return spring that you can see here. There's also a spring on the end of the bracket there. So essentially this needs to be long enough so that it's putting a little bit of preload on those springs. So once I did that, it worked pretty well. Just got some video now which I shot quite some time ago that shows the various parts of this assembly. So here's the housing, and here is the original bearing bush which I replaced. And here's the new bearing bush that I made up, and just showing where the new bearing bush goes. So I've just got a few photos of the various parts of the accelerator assembly before I cleaned them up and had them painted. So I guess you can see why I bothered to get it done. It would have looked pretty odd putting these parts back in the car as it is now. Now, the next item on my little list is a refit choke cable engine end, although that probably doesn't really describe what I had to do all that well. If you look here now, you can see I've got a nice new choke cable, but there's a bit of a story behind that, which I'll come to in a minute. Now, I had to make up a new choke cable that you can see here, and the reason I had to do that is I ended up accidentally damaging the original cable as I was trying to polish it up with a wire brush on my bench grinder. The wire brush ended up eating it. So I subsequently ended up buying a reproduction choke cable that was as close to the original as I could find. The replacement cable that I got looks like this. The outer part of it looks almost identical to the original Rover P3 cable. So that actually looks very similar to what was there originally. And then I set about modifying it so it could fit to the original choke knob. It works quite well now, so I'll give a little demo of that. So here's a choke knob, or cold start as Rover call it. It works quite nicely, nice free movement. The main difficult part was just to figure out a way of connecting the new replacement cable to the back end of this knob. Here's a couple of photos of the choke knob assembly before I did any work on it. Unfortunately, I didn't take any photos of when I fitted the new replacement cable. Suffice to say that I figured out a way of drilling a couple of small holes and fitting some grub screws which retain the inner cable. Now, next item on my list is item 4, fit fuel filter by immersing existing connections in hot water to loosen. That's going to sound like a bit of a confusing story. So this job is all about getting back to an inline fuel filter. So you can see I've already done the job. However, there is a bit of a long-running saga with this fuel line in general, which I need to really tell to give some context to this job really. So when I was initially working towards getting the engine running for the first time, I replaced the fuel line because I think it still had its original fuel line from 1949 and that leaked like a sieve. So I replaced the line, and then at some point I thought it'd be a good idea to have an inline fuel filter. I cleaned out the fuel tank, but you know what it's like, you can't be 100% sure you got everything out of there, so I thought it'd be a good idea to have that filter. So I did that, and then I proceeded to getting the engine running for the first time, but I found that I had a problem with the fuel flow to the carburetor. So I incorrectly assumed that might be at least partly caused by the inline fuel filter. So I got rid of that and I replaced it with a piece of fuel line and a couple of brass connectors that you can see here. But then eventually I figured the problem had nothing to do with the fuel filter, it had more to do with the fuel pump. Now what I've got here now is actually a new replacement SU fuel pump that looks pretty much like the original. So that solved that problem. So now that I realise what the problem really was, this job is all about going back to an inline fuel filter. It turned out to be a little bit more complicated to go back than I hoped, because I had all sorts of problems trying to loosen this pipe from these brass fittings. So immersing it in hot water did the trick quite nicely. So back to an inline fuel filter now, and all looking pretty good. I think I'll stick with that idea for a while, at least until I run a few tanks of fuel through it. But eventually I think I'll fit this fuel line. So this is a reproduction fuel line that looks very much like the original that I got from Meteor Spares in the UK. So it'd be nice to go back to the original look, given that it is a very nice looking fuel line. Now item 5 on my list sounds pretty simple: remove and tighten fuel tank end of fuel line. So I'll go and have a look at what I'm talking about there, but it didn't end up being that simple. So at the back of the car now, you can see the fuel line here that I'm referring to. Initially I left it fairly loose because I was a little paranoid about stripping the thread here, partly because I had a new fuel pickup unit made here, and a very nice unit it is too, that's made by a company in England called the Four Ashes Garage, which I think mostly make parts for early model Aston Martins. So I had that made up, and I want to be careful not to damage it. So I made sure everything was sort of lined up first before I tightened it up. So that's what I'm referring to there. So I did that, but that then revealed another problem, which I'll come to now. Actually, whilst we're here, I'll just mention I am getting a little optimistic. You can see I've got my picnic rug there, so ready for its first drive. Very nice Christmas present that I got last Christmas. But there ended up being quite a lot more to this fixing the fuel line story than I originally anticipated. So I'll show you a photo here now which will explain the problem that I encountered. So that brings me to item 6 on my list. Turns out I should read turns out, but I've got turn out. The rear section of the fuel line had a split in it. So I then had to remove the entire fuel line. Well, I didn't have to, I could just remove the back half, but I thought whilst I was at it, I might as well get the whole line remade. So I took it to a company here in Adelaide called Power Brakes that have expertise in mucking around with, mostly with brake lines, but the fuel line is quite similar. So this is a photo of the split fuel line. The fuel line is divided into 2 sections, so this split was in the rear section of the fuel line. The whole thing was all a bit disappointing, to be honest. So I've been working towards restarting the engine, so it would have been the first engine restart since major body repairs were done, and since most of the reassembly was done. So I was getting all excited. I charged up the battery, turned on the ignition, and the fuel pump ticked away, and I thought to myself, it's ticking away a bit madly, but I didn't think too much of it. And then I could smell a very strong smell of fuel, and then I thought to myself, I'm probably not going to be starting the engine today. I think this fuel line must have been damaged when the body was removed from the chassis, because this fuel line actually tracks along one of the chassis rails. Next item on my list is item 7, change engine oil, gearbox oil, top up diff and kingpins and steering box. that's all pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go into too much detail there. Suffice to say that I've been using Penrite Oils, which is an Australian company. You can see it's a better class of oil for a better class of car. So here we are at the back of the car. I'm just going to show you my list again, and we'll as we work our way through this list. So you can see the next item on my list is item 8, make and fit pin to retain fuel cap catch. I'll show you what I'm talking about there. So at the back of the car now, and here's the lovely chrome fuel cap. Now originally when I bought the car, and up until quite recently, this little latch that I'm pointing to here it has a pin through here, but instead of a pin, it had a split pin that looked something like this holding it together. Now I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see things here, but what I end up doing is I reamed out this pinhole to 1/8 of an inch, and then I turned up a little stainless steel pin that you can see here. Well, hopefully you can see it here. So really it's more of a nice, neat engineering job now, and it works quite well. So if you press that comes open, and then you press that like so, and it shuts. Item 9 on my list is drain, fuel and replenish. I guess that's pretty self-explanatory. Now whilst the car was away for body repairs and so on, it had been sitting for a long time, so the fuel that I had in there was probably a couple of years old. So I wanted to drain that off. So I'm going to crawl under the car now. Let's have a bit of a look, and I'll show you. There's a little drain plug here at the bottom of the fuel tank. So pretty self-explanatory. Just had to drain that fuel off and then put some new fuel in. And basically what I'm working towards here is restarting the engine after it hadn't been started for a while. So I'm sitting down at the back of the car now, so I'll move on to item 10 on my list. Make rubber blanking bung for boot just above the fuel connection. So I'll go and show you what I'm talking about there. So at the back of the car now, I'm just going to open the boot very carefully. There we go, going down, going down, going down. So this blanking plate I'm referring to is the plate you can see here. So this is the one that I've made up. When I originally bought the car, it just had a piece of plywood sitting over this inspection hole, and it was just sitting there loosely. Now, something to explain is this floor isn't original, although when I bought the car it was. So this has been remanufactured because the original was pretty rusty. But even on the original, I couldn't see any screw holes around here. So it looks like it just has some sort of bung here. So that's what I've tried to do. So that's plywood, and then I've got rubber backing there, and that's a sort of nice, neat fit in that hole. Well, hi again. I'm thinking that's probably about enough for my first vlog, otherwise it ends up being a very long video. I've got more stuff to cover in a second vlog, which I will really try and get out as soon as I can. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in another video. So bye for now.